The liberation of Nazi concentration camps unveiled unimaginable horrors. But what happened next? Confronted with systematic genocide, emaciated survivors and Allied soldiers faced a profound moral crisis. Their brutal retribution against SS guards stands as a raw and controversial chapter, forcing a haunting question: where does justice end and vengeance begin? The end of the nightmare. The collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945 did not bring a peaceful transition for the architects and enforcers of its most horrific institution, the concentration camp system. As Allied forces advanced deep into German territory, the terrifying reality of the camps began to unfurl before them. For the SS guards, warders, and commanders who had operated these sites of industrial-scale murder, the end of the war signaled the beginning of a desperate scramble for survival. Their world, once defined by absolute power and brutal order, was dissolving into chaos, and with it, any hope of a dignified surrender vanished. Knowing the fate that likely awaited them at the hands of their victims or in the courtrooms of the victorious Allies, these men embarked on a frantic effort to evade capture. Many shed their distinctive uniforms, burning them or swapping them for ragged civilian clothes or even the striped pajamas of their prisoners in a macabre attempt to blend in. They forged new identification papers, inventing benign pasts as farmers, clerks, or conscripted soldiers who had no choice in their assignments. Some fled into the surrounding forests, hoping to disappear until the initial fury had passed. Others sought to join the vast columns of regular Wehrmacht soldiers surrendering to the Americans and British, betting that the confusion would provide cover. Yet for the vast majority, these efforts were in vain. Their faces were etched into the memories of the survivors. Their accents, their mannerisms, and the very fear they instilled made them conspicuous. The liberating soldiers, though initially overwhelmed, quickly became adept at identifying and separating these war criminals from the legitimate prisoners of war. The net was closing, and it was closing fast. The guards' anticipation of a formal trial, a prospect that itself promised a death sentence, was a privilege few would ultimately experience. For many, justice would be far more immediate and visceral. Meanwhile, the Allied soldiers, hardened by years of combat across Europe, believed they were prepared for what they would find. They had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, the bitter cold of the Ardennes, and across the Rhine. They had witnessed death in its many forms. But nothing in their experience could have prepared them for the sensory assault of liberating a camp like Dachau. The first indicator was often the smell, a sweet, putrid, and unmistakable odor of decay that permeated the air for miles around, a foul beacon guiding them to a place of unimaginable suffering. As the gates were forced open, the visual horror confirmed what their noses had already told them. They were met with a vision of hell on earth. Emaciated figures, little more than living skeletons clad in filthy rags, stared out from sunken eyes with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Their bodies were ravaged by starvation, disease, and relentless labor. Beyond them lay the undeniable evidence of the Nazis' final frantic attempt to hide their crimes: piles of corpses, some half-burned in pits or pyres, others left to decompose where they had fallen. Railcars stood on sidings, filled with the lifeless bodies of prisoners who had perished during forced evacuations from other camps. The psychological impact on the liberators was immediate and profound. Battle-weary GIs who had faced down German panzers broke down and wept. Others turned away to vomit, their stomachs churning at the overwhelming stench of death and the sight of such profound human degradation. A cold, furious rage began to simmer among the men, replacing their initial shock and revulsion. This was not the abstract evil they had been fighting against. This was its tangible, visceral result. These were not soldiers, they were torturers, and their victims were defenseless civilians. The standard rules of war, the protocols for handling surrendered personnel, suddenly felt grotesquely inadequate in the face of such calculated barbarity. The nightmare of the camps was ending, but a new, and for some, a final reckoning was about to begin. But as the gates opened, justice was taken from the courts. What happened when liberators, faced with unspeakable horror, chose to become executioners. The Dachau massacre begins. On April 29, 1945, the U.S. Army's 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions liberated Dachau. But what began as a military operation instantly became a scene of primal retribution. SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker, the camp's commandant, emerged to surrender, expecting military convention to protect him. Instead, a soldier from the 45th Division, enraged after witnessing the camp's horrors, shot him point-blank in the eye, a symbolic end for a man who had ignored immense suffering. This single act ignited long-suppressed fury. The gunshot served as a signal to the emaciated prisoners. Overcoming years of starvation and abuse, they found strength in their desperation for justice. Seeing their captors now disarmed and vulnerable, they surged forward using shovels, picks, rocks, and their bare hands. They beat and throttled the SS guards in a visceral, personal vengeance, each strike representing years of trauma. American soldiers did not intervene. Officers like Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks faced an impossible moral dilemma: follow military rules protecting prisoners or honor the demand for justice. Most turned their backs, deliberately allowing the violence. Some even secretly handed weapons to prisoners, enabling the retribution they felt was justified. This tacit approval transformed chaos into a sanctioned purge. The violence targeted the SS Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head units, identifiable even without full uniforms. As American troops rounded up remaining SS personnel, the anger among liberators and liberated intensified. Normal rules were suspended. Tension peaked near the coal yard, where American troops guarded 50 to 70 captured Germans, including SS and Wehrmacht soldiers. As the group marched, several were pulled away and killed by enraged GIs or prisoners. Senior officers, sensing loss of control, consciously withdrew. When Lieutenant Colonel Sparks left the area, a machine gunner opened fire on the clustered prisoners, cutting down dozens in a 30-second burst. While officially triggered by a perceived threat, soldiers understood it as an execution. The machine gunner was disarmed, but the damage was done. The yard was strewn with dead and dying men. Former prisoners descended on the wounded with renewed frenzy, using shovels and tools to deliver final blows. American soldiers again stood by, allowing the violence. The Dachau massacre had only just begun. The first shot unleashed a wave of fury, but as Dachau's chaos subsided, what form would the retribution take when it became deliberate and systematic? The Yard of Revenge. The area near Dachau's coal yard, once a site of forced labor, became the stage for the camp's final reckoning. After an initial machine gun burst killed dozens of SS guards and other German personnel, the atmosphere remained charged with rage. For prisoners and liberators alike, impersonal gunfire could not satisfy the deep personal craving for retribution born from years of torture. As formal military action paused, prisoners surged into the yard. Their skeletal frames clad in striped uniforms, they wielded shovels, picks, clubs, and their bare hands. Their eyes, once hollow, now burned with furious intensity. They fell upon the wounded and dead with horrifying fervor, transforming the scene into a medieval-like spectacle of vengeance. The sound of gunfire gave way to the sickening thuds of tools striking flesh and bone. Engineers, teachers, and tailors became executioners, bludgeoning those who had overseen their starvation and humiliation. Some guards were torn apart by the mob, others had their skulls crushed. This was not merely killing, it was annihilation, an attempt to physically erase their tormentors and undo years of dehumanization. American soldiers maintained a stance of deliberate non-intervention. Officers like Lieutenant Colonel Sparks had effectively ceded control, while rank-and-file GIs formed a loose perimeter not to protect Germans, but to contain the violence. Their grim, satisfied expressions revealed their perspective. This was a moral necessity, not a war crime. Having witnessed boxcars overflowing with corpses and living skeletons, they turned their backs, smoked, and stared blankly, allowing the prisoners their catharsis. This silent sanction was as powerful as any order. The death toll in the coal yard reached approximately 40 SS men, though many were mutilated beyond recognition. This was not a structured execution, but a spontaneous collective act of ancient justice, an eye for an eye. Each swing of a shovel struck against the arbitrary beatings, medical experiments, starvation, and constant threat of death the prisoners had endured. The senior command, aware of the breach of military law, consciously withdrew from the area to maintain deniability. Officers like Major General Henning Linden absented themselves to avoid implication in the ill treatment of prisoners of war. This calculated move granted tacit approval to those below, suspending the rules of engagement for a full day. Dachau now operated under its own brutal code. The message was unequivocal. SS personnel were outlaws, undeserving of Geneva Convention protections, and their fate would be decided by those they had wronged. In an hour, the yard became a ground of vengeance, and the killing wasn't over. As fury turned cold, how would retribution shift toward deliberate, systematic execution? The same exact thing: death. The frenzied violence in the coal yard, while cathartic for the prisoners, was chaotic and incomplete. As the initial raw fury began to subside, a colder, more calculated form of justice took its place. The American liberators, having borne witness to the full scope of the camp's horrors, transitioned from passive observers to active agents of retribution. The sentiment among the GIs was unanimous and unequivocal. The architects and enforcers of this nightmare deserved no mercy, no protection, and no day in court. They deserved the same exact fate they had meted out to thousands of innocent people: summary execution. This shift in approach was marked by a movement toward organized killing. The chosen site for this grim task was a grimly familiar one for the prisoners: a large bullet-pocked wall near the camp's hospital and utility area. This wall was not new to violence. It was the camp's traditional Hinrichtungsmauer, execution wall, where countless inmates had been shot by SS firing squads for infractions or simply for sport. The symbolism was potent and deliberate. By using the Nazis' own killing ground, the liberators were ensuring that the perpetrators would die on the very site of their crimes, a final act of poetic justice. The process began systematically. American troops, under the direction of junior officers, began rounding up surviving SS personnel who had been missed in the initial sweep or discovered in hiding. They were also pulled from the hospital barracks, where wounded SS men had been receiving treatment. These men were not given medical care. Instead, they were dragged from their beds, their bandages still wrapped around wounds from the recent battle or the violence in the yard. They were forced to their feet and marched toward the wall. There was no pretense of a trial, no reading of rights, no last rites. The purpose was singular and clear. A famous photograph, taken by an army photographer, captures the chillingly clinical nature of this phase. It shows a young American lieutenant, his face a mask of grim determination, overseeing a makeshift firing squad composed of fellow soldiers. A group of German prisoners, their hands on their heads, kneel before the wall. The image is stark and devoid of the chaos of the coal yard. This is execution as a military duty. The lieutenant later identified himself as Howard Buechner, a medical officer with the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment. In his account, he stated that the order was given, and a volley of shots rang out, cutting down the kneeling men. The process was repeated with subsequent groups. The justification for these actions, later articulated by participants like Buechner, was rooted in the overwhelming evidence of atrocity. The soldiers were not executing soldiers. They were exterminating vermin. They had seen the stacked corpses, the emaciated survivors, the gas chambers, and the crematoria. The moral shock was so profound that it overrode military law. The common defense, often unspoken but universally understood, was that they were merely finishing the job, administering the justice that the Nazi system itself had made necessary. The phrase, "they had it coming," was not a glib remark, but a deeply held conviction. After each round of shooting, a detail would move in to clear the bodies. The wounded who showed any signs of life were given a coup de grâce. The number killed at the wall is a subject of historical debate. with estimates ranging from a conservative 30 to over 100. Berkner himself would later claim that the total number of SS men killed that day, including those in the yard and at the wall, was 346. This figure, while difficult to verify precisely, points to the scale of the retribution. The Americans involved ensured that no witnesses from the International Red Cross or higher command were present during these executions. The final act of this grim symphony involved the camp's hospital. American soldiers, their resolve hardened by what they had seen and done, entered the wards where wounded SS guards were convalescing. These men, who moments before had been under the care of captured German medics, were now identified not as patients, but as war criminals. They were forcibly removed from their beds. Those who could walk were marched to the wall. Those who could not were dragged on stretchers or simply pulled across the ground. There was no distinction made between the able-bodied and the critically wounded. Complicity in the camp's operations was the only criteria that mattered. All were shot. By the end of the day, the area around the execution wall was silent, save for the moans of the dying being silenced by final gunshots. The perpetrators faced the same fate they delivered. But would vengeance end with the SS, or turn inward toward the collaborators within the prisoner ranks? Justice of the oppressed. The brutal execution of the SS guards did not mark the end of the violence within the liberated camps. As the sun set on Dachau on April 29, 1945, a new and even more complex wave of retribution began to swell from within the prisoner population itself. The primary targets of this internal purge were not the uniformed oppressors, who had largely been eliminated, but their accomplices, the capos and block elders, fellow prisoners who had been granted positions of authority by the SS in exchange for enforcing order through brutality and collaboration. This chapter of the reckoning was darker and more intimate, a settling of scores among the victims themselves. The capo system was a cornerstone of Nazi concentration camp administration, a deliberately cruel strategy designed to break solidarity among inmates and force them into complicity with their own oppression. Capos were typically chosen from the criminal underworld or from groups of prisoners deemed anti-social, though sometimes political prisoners were coerced into the role. They were given extra rations, better clothing, and private quarters. In return, they were expected to manage the labor details, administer discipline with clubs and whips, and report any infractions or escape plans to the SS. Their cruelty often surpassed that of the German guards as they sought to prove their loyalty and maintain their privileged status. For the ordinary prisoner, the capo was the immediate and daily face of terror. While an SS guard might deliver a beating or execute a prisoner, it was often the capo who ensured the work quotas were met through relentless harassment, who decided who received their meager soup ration, and who wielded a truncheon with vicious enthusiasm. This betrayal from within their own ranks bred a deep, festering hatred that far exceeded the abstract loathing for the distant SS command. The capos were traitors, and their crimes were personal. When the American troops effectively sanctioned vengeance by turning a blind eye to the killing of SS men, they unknowingly greenlit this internal purge as well. For the prisoners, the principle was the same. Those guilty of atrocities must be punished. As night fell on the liberated camp, groups of prisoners began to seek out known capos and collaborators. There was no formal tribunal. Identification was based on collective memory and accusation. The process was swift and merciless. The methods of execution were often gruesomely symbolic, reflecting the specific nature of the capos' crimes. Many were beaten to death with the very clubs they had used on others. Some were strangled with wires or their own uniforms, a silent and personal end. Others were hanged from the same rafters in the barracks where they had once tyrannized their fellow inmates. In the most violent cases, capos were torn apart by mobs of prisoners, their bodies mutilated in a frenzy of long-suppressed rage. The number of these internal executions on the first night of liberation is estimated to be around 300, a staggering figure that underscores the scale of the collaboration and the depth of the bitterness it inspired. This bloody night posed a profound moral dilemma for the American liberators. Having themselves participated in or allowed extrajudicial killings, they were in no position to impose order and uphold the law now. They largely remained in their positions on the perimeter, hearing the sounds of violence from within the barracks but choosing not to intervene. Their primary mission, to secure the camp and tend to the living, took precedence over protecting those who were now seen as legitimate targets of the prisoners' wrath. The GIs, who hours before had been facilitating vengeance, now became passive witnesses to a civil war among the survivors. The purge of the capos reveals a tragic and often overlooked dimension of liberation. The psychological trauma of the survivors did not vanish with the departure of the SS. The camp had created a distorted moral universe where the line between victim and perpetrator could blur. The need for justice was inextricably linked with a need for catharsis and the reclamation of power. By executing their former oppressors, both German and collaborators, the prisoners were not only seeking revenge but also attempting to destroy the entire hierarchy of terror under which they had suffered, and to actively reclaim agency over their own lives and fates. This internal reckoning served as a grim warning to any who might have considered themselves safe by virtue of their prisoner status. It affirmed that complicity, not just nationality or uniform, would be punished. The events of that first night at Dachau established a pattern that would be repeated with variations in other camps like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. The liberation was not a single moment of pure joy, but a complex and often violent transition, where the trauma of the past erupted into the present, demanding a terrible price from all who had been touched by it. The hunt for collaborators showed betrayal would not be forgiven. As this internal purge ended, how would vengeance unfold in camps liberated under different conditions? Ohrdruf's lynch law. The wave of prisoner-led retribution was not confined to Dachau. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, liberating camp after camp, a similar pattern of violence often unfolded, shaped by the specific circumstances of each site's liberation. The subcamp of Ohrdruf, part of the Buchenwald system, and one of the first camps liberated by American troops on April 4, 1945, presents a stark example of vengeance occurring even before the formal arrival of liberating forces. Here, the prisoners took the initiative, delivering their own brutal justice to their captors in a spontaneous uprising. Unlike Dachau, where the SS garrison was largely present at the moment of liberation, the staff at Ohrdruf had been demoralized and disorganized by the rapid Allied advance. In early April, most of the SS guards and administrators, fearing the impending arrival of American troops, forced the majority of the camp's prisoners on a death march southward, deeper into Germany. Those too weak or sick to march were left behind to die. However, a core group of prisoners remained, hiding within the camp or in the surrounding woods, determined not to be abandoned. They watched as their tormentors, now panicked and desperate, made preparations to flee. Seizing the opportunity presented by the chaos of the SS evacuation, these remaining prisoners launched their own attack. They ambushed isolated guards, overpowering them with sheer numbers and using improvised weapons, rocks, tools, and knives fashioned from stolen metal. The element of surprise was their greatest ally. Demoralized and no longer backed by the authority of the Reich, the guards put up little resistance. The prisoners' vengeance was swift and total. By the time advance elements of the US 4th Armored Division, followed by the 89th Infantry Division, arrived at Ohrdruf on April 4th, they found a camp largely devoid of living SS personnel. The prisoners had already executed many of their captors. What greeted the American soldiers, led by Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, a week later on a mandated tour to witness the atrocities, was not a scene of ongoing massacre, but its gruesome aftermath. The generals and the accompanying photojournalists were confronted with the evidence of the prisoners' justice. Photographs taken that day show the lynched bodies of camp guards, strung up on the very gallows they had used for executions. Other images reveal guards who had been beaten to death, their bodies dismembered and mutilated. Some had their skulls crushed by rocks or blunt instruments. Their remains were left where they fell, amidst the emaciated corpses of their victims. The presence of high-ranking American officials and the press at Ohrdruf was pivotal. The images and reports from this camp were among the first to be widely disseminated to the Allied public, providing incontrovertible proof of Nazi barbarity. Importantly, they also documented the extreme response it provoked. The photographs of lynched guards were not censored. They were published alongside images of the victims, creating a narrative that, while shocking, carried an undeniable tone of moral ambiguity. The public saw not only the crime but the raw, brutal justice it had inspired. The American military leadership, including the notoriously hard-nosed General Patton, made no effort to condemn the prisoners' actions. The sight of the camp had shaken them to their core, and the fate of the guards seemed a natural if grim consequence. The violence at Ohrdruf was significant because it was almost entirely prisoner-led and occurred prior to formal liberation. It demonstrated that the desire for retribution was an intrinsic impulse among the survivors, not merely a reaction encouraged by the presence of Allied troops. The prisoners at Ohrdruf did not wait for permission or for a military tribunal. They took advantage of the power vacuum created by the collapsing Nazi regime to deliver their own form of justice. Their actions sent a clear message that echoed through the camp system. The SS could run, but they could not ultimately hide from the wrath of those they had tortured. The liberation of Ohrdruf and the discovery of its horrors, including the evidence of the prisoners' vengeance, had a direct policy impact. It was after seeing Ohrdruf that Eisenhower made the crucial decision to compel German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camps, to document the atrocities extensively with film and photography, and to invite congressional and press delegations to witness the evidence. He understood that the sheer scale of the evil would be doubted in the future. The prisoners' brutal retaliation, frozen in those photographs, served as a powerful, visceral testament to the conditions that could drive human beings to such extremes. It was proof that the horrors of the camp were so profound that they could only be answered with a violence that transcended law. Ohrdruf's images revealed Nazi crimes and fierce retribution. But if prisoners acted before liberation, what occurred when they seized a camp through their own organized uprising? The Buchenwald Uprising. Buchenwald was not liberated in the traditional sense by external forces. It was, to a remarkable degree, self-liberated. By April 1945, an intricate and highly organized underground resistance movement had been operating within the camp for years, led primarily by seasoned political prisoners, including captured Soviet Red Army officers and German communists. This clandestine network had managed to smuggle in weapons, assemble a crude arsenal of stolen tools and makeshift arms, and establish a military-style chain of command. As the distant thunder of American artillery grew louder, the committee knew the time for revolt was near. On April 11, 1945, with U.S. forces of the 6th Armored Division engaging German troops on the outskirts of Weimar, the prisoners launched their uprising, seizing control of their own destiny and unleashing a long-planned vengeance upon their captors. The initial assault was swift and coordinated. Using coded signals, armed prisoner commandos stormed the watchtowers, overpowering the SS guards stationed there. Others attacked the armory and seized control of the camp's main gate. The ensuing firefight was chaotic and brutal. Many SS guards were killed in the initial burst of fighting, shot down by their own weapons now in the hands of their former victims. The sound of gunfire and the sight of the black prisoner flag raised over the watchtowers signaled that the camp was in revolt. By the time the first American tanks rolled through the gates hours later, the prisoners were already in control of the camp compound. The GIs were met not by a scene of passive liberation, but by an armed, organized resistance that had already secured its own freedom. The surviving SS guards and camp functionaries who had not fled or been killed in the uprising were now at the complete mercy of the International Prisoners Committee. There would be no pretense of handing them over for a formal trial. The committee, embodying the collective will of the survivors, became the judge, jury, and executioner. The captives were rounded up and subjected to a violent and very public reckoning. Many were dragged to the camp's Appellplatz, roll call square, where they were beaten and clubbed by a furious crowd of survivors. Others were thrown into the dreaded bunker, the camp's punishment cells, where they were forced to kneel on the cold stone floors, experiencing a fraction of the torment they had inflicted. The methods of execution were varied and reflected the years of accumulated hatred. Some guards were simply beaten to death by mobs using fists, clubs, and rocks, a slow and personal form of justice. Others were lynched. The most common and symbolic fate was death by hanging from the same meat hooks in the camp laundry building or the rafters of the stable that had been used for torture and punishment. For the prisoners, this was not merely killing. It was an act of reclamation and symbolic inversion. They were turning the instruments of their own oppression against their creators. A quick death by a noose was considered a relative mercy, a humane end compared to the prolonged torture many prisoners had endured. The American troops who entered Buchenwald, including elements of the 6th Armored and the 80th Infantry Division, were confronted with this ongoing spectacle of retribution. Their reaction was one of tacit acceptance. After witnessing the camp's crematorium still filled with bodies, the piles of emaciated corpses, and the skeletal state of the survivors, the GIs made no move to stop the violence. Officers turned a blind eye, understanding that this was a necessary catharsis for the men who had endured the unimaginable. There was no sympathy for the captured SS. The GIs saw the prisoners not as criminals, but as victors exacting a rightful price from a defeated and monstrous enemy. In some cases, American soldiers even provided rope or looked the other way as prisoners led their captors to the gallows. The vengeance at Buchenwald was distinct in its level of organization. This was not the spontaneous, frenzied violence of Dachau's coal yard. It was a calculated, deliberate purge directed by a committee that had been planning for this moment for years. They systematically targeted not only the remaining SS, but also the most hated capos and prisoner collaborators within their own ranks. The uprising and its bloody aftermath were the culmination of a long-standing shadow war within the camp, and its leaders felt absolutely justified in their actions. They had operated under a simple, brutal code: that those who had willingly participated in the camp's machinery of death had forfeited any right to mercy or a formal legal process. The liberation of Buchenwald stands as a powerful testament to human resilience and the thirst for self-determination. It demonstrated that even within the most oppressive system, resistance could fester and eventually erupt. The prisoners' successful uprising and their subsequent administration of justice sent a shockwave through the region. It proved that the myth of SS invincibility was broken and that the victims could become the arbiters of fate. The events of April 11th, 1945 at Buchenwald remain a complex legacy, a story of incredible courage and organization, but also one of unflinching, brutal revenge, demonstrating that the line between justice and vengeance can become indistinguishable in the shadow of the crematoria. Buchenwald's prisoners seized their own freedom and justice. Would other Allied forces also stand aside or impose controlled retribution? A different kind of punishment. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, by British and Canadian troops of the 11th Armoured Division presented a horrifying tableau of human suffering that was, in many ways, unparalleled. Unlike camps in the East that were designed for systematic extermination, Bergen-Belsen had become a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from other camps. The result was a perfect storm of disease, starvation, and neglect. The liberators found over 60,000 emaciated prisoners, most critically ill with typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery, and 13,000 unburied corpses lying in heaps around the camp. The scale of the humanitarian disaster was so overwhelming that the immediate military objective shifted from combat to a desperate battle against disease and starvation. This shift in priority dictated a radically different approach to the captured SS guards. There was no time for mass executions. Every available hand was needed for the Herculean task of cleaning the camp and preventing the complete decimation of the survivors by epidemic. The British command, under Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, made a calculated and symbolic decision. They would force the perpetrators to confront the physical reality of their crimes directly. Approximately 80 SS men and women, including the notorious camp commandant Josef Kramer and Irma Gries, were captured and compelled to participate in the burial of the dead. This was not merely a labor detail, it was a form of psychological and biological punishment designed to be its own kind of execution. The process was gruesome and deliberate. The SS guards were provided with no protective equipment, no gloves, no masks, no shovels with long handles. They were forced to handle the rotting, disease-ridden corpses with their bare hands, dragging the emaciated, often contorted bodies to mass graves. They had to lift the corpses onto stretchers, carry them to the open pits, and lay them in rows. The stench was unbearable, a vile miasma of decay that permeated their hair, skin, and clothing. The sight of so much death, which they had caused through deliberate neglect, was inescapable. For men and women who had viewed the prisoners as subhuman, Untermenschen, this forced intimacy with their victims was a profound and horrifying violation. The British soldiers overseeing this work showed no pity. They enforced the task with cold efficiency, often using rifle butts to prod any guard who hesitated or slowed down. The guards were forbidden from showing any sign of disrespect, such as covering their noses or looking away. They were made to look, to touch, and to smell the consequences of their actions. This was a calculated effort to force a moral reckoning, to make them understand the human cost of their ideology in the most visceral way possible. It was a psychological warfare tactic aimed at the soul, far more complex than a simple bullet. The punishment, however, was not merely psychological, it was lethally practical. The corpses were saturated with typhus-infected lice. By handling them directly, the SS guards were exposed to the very epidemic they had allowed to rage unchecked through the camp. The British medical officers were aware of this risk, but did nothing to mitigate it. It was seen as a form of poetic justice, a natural consequence of the guards being forced to clean up their own mess. As a result, approximately 20 of the forced labor detail contracted typhus and died slow, agonizing deaths in captivity within days of the liberation. They had been sentenced not by a court, but by the biological fallout of their own crimes. This British method of retribution was notably different from the American approach. It was less about the immediate, cathartic release of violence and more about a sustained, grim lesson in responsibility. It was a form of justice that emphasized the grotesque reality of the crime scene rather than the personal vengeance of the victims. While prisoners at Bergen-Belsen were too weak to orchestrate a large-scale violent revolt, there were isolated incidents of revenge. However, the British military authorities generally maintained tighter control, channeling the need for retribution into this controlled, symbolic, and ultimately deadly form of forced labor. The legacy of Bergen-Belsen's liberation is thus a complex one. It is remembered for the horrific images of the piles of dead and the heroic efforts of British medical teams to save the survivors. But it is also remembered for this unique and chilling form of punishment. The footage and photographs of SS guards, their faces masks of revulsion and fear, dragging corpses into pits, became some of the most iconic images of the Holocaust's aftermath. They served as powerful evidence in the subsequent war crimes trials at Lüneburg, where Kramer, Gries, and others were tried and executed. The British had found a way to make the perpetrators not only prisoners, but also active participants in documenting their own guilt, creating an undeniable record of complicity that was both moral and mortal in its consequences. Revenge came not only by weapon, but by disease and forced labor. As symbolic justice unfolded in the West, how would the Soviets, driven by stated vengeance, differ in their retribution? The instruments of torment. The retribution enacted by liberated prisoners was not random violence. It was often a macabre and deliberate form of poetic justice, where the tools of their own torture and degradation were turned against the perpetrators. This chapter delves into the grimly symbolic methods of execution that emerged across the liberated camps, methods that were designed to make the guards experience a fraction of the agony they had inflicted. Survivor diaries and fragmentary accounts provide a harrowing record of this brutal, symbolic vengeance, revealing a depth of trauma that could only be expressed through mirrored violence. The phenomenon was widespread. At camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and many smaller sub-camps, prisoners did not simply shoot or hang their former captors. They sought a darker symmetry. Guards who had operated the brutal punishment apparatus now found themselves its subjects. There are accounts from multiple camps of SS men being beaten to death on the Bock, whipping block, their backs flayed by the same lashes they had wielded. Others were locked inside standing cells, cramped vertical coffers where movement was impossible, and left to die of thirst and suffocation, a fate they had sentenced countless inmates to endure. The crematoria, the ultimate symbol of the Nazi factory of death, became sites of grim irony. In several instances, SS guards who had overseen the burning of corpses were themselves thrown alive into the still smouldering fires of the crematorium furnaces or onto pyres built for the dead. This was not just killing, it was an attempt to utterly erase the perpetrators using their own chosen method of erasure, condemning them to the same anonymous fiery oblivion to which they had consigned millions. The violence often mirrored specific remembered cruelties. A guard known for particularly savage dog attacks might be set upon by prisoners using clubs and knives, mimicking a mauling. Another, who had taken pleasure in crushing prisoners' hands in doorframes, might have his own limbs systematically broken. The goal was recognition, forcing the guard to understand in his final moments the specific nature of the crime for which he was being punished. This was justice as a gruesome reflection, a desperate attempt to balance the scales of suffering through horrific imitation. Amid this catalogue of terror, one notorious execution method was conspicuously absent: being hunted to death by dogs. The guard dogs themselves, often fearsome German shepherds trained to savage prisoners, met a swift and merciless end. They were seen not as innocent animals, but as willing instruments of terror, extensions of their handlers' cruelty. Prisoners and Allied soldiers alike shot them on sight. This rejection of a method so beloved by the SS is telling. It suggests a moral line, however faint, even in the midst of the fury. To use the same method would have been to become too much like the oppressor, to descend completely into the very bestiality they were seeking to punish. For the Allied soldiers who witnessed these acts, the response was typically a stunned and grim acquiescence. They understood that they were witnessing something beyond conventional morality, a raw settling of accounts born from years of unimaginable abuse. Officers, recognizing the profound trauma playing out before them, rarely gave orders to stop it. To intervene would have been to invalidate the survivors' suffering and their right to reclaim agency in the most visceral way possible. The GI's role often evolved into one of containment, ensuring the violence did not spill over into unintended targets, rather than prevention. This chapter of the reckoning is perhaps the most difficult to comprehend. It transcends the simple binary of justice and revenge, entering the realm of psychological catharsis through brutal reenactment. The prisoners were using a violent language their captors would understand. By employing the instruments of torment, they were delivering a final, unmistakable message. This is what you did. Now feel it. It was a horrific form of communication, born in the absolute zero of human morality that was the concentration camp universe. These actions stand as a stark testament to the fact that the liberation of the camps was not the end of the horror, but the moment when the full, pent-up horror of the preceding years erupted in a final, terrifying convulsion. When tools of torture were turned on their creators, the guards felt their victims' agony. But what occurred when vengeance was ordered from a dictator's office, not by soldiers or prisoners? Stalin's verdict. The fate of Nazi war criminals was not always decided in the chaotic heat of liberation or the tortured conscience of a survivor. In the East, under the advancing Soviet Red Army, the process could be chillingly bureaucratic, emanating from the very top of a political system that itself was no stranger to summary execution and purges. The case of the Pilsenstow concentration camp in western Poland illustrates how the matter of retribution could be resolved in a brief, cryptic conversation in the Kremlin, far from the stench of the camps and the cries of the victims. This was vengeance not as a spontaneous outburst, but as cold, state-sanctioned policy. As the First Belarusian Front, under the command of the Polish Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossowski, advanced relentlessly westward in the spring of 1945, they overran numerous concentration and labor camps. One such camp was Pilsen Stowe, a likely misspelling or misremembering of a camp name in the original transcript, which held a significant population of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians. Understanding the camp's symbolic importance and its high number of Soviet citizens, Rokossowski duly reported its imminent capture to his ultimate superior, Joseph Stalin. The subsequent dialogue, as recounted in Soviet political and military law, was a masterclass in coded language and implied command. Rokossowski, a seasoned commander, reportedly contacted Stalin to seek guidance on the standard procedure for handling the captured camp guards and staff. The exchange was stark. Rokossowski: "Comrade Stalin, what should we do with the concentration camp guards?" Stalin, after a pause: "I do not understand you, Comrade Rokossowski. To deal with whom?" Rokossowski: "With the concentration camp guards, Comrade Stalin." Stalin: "What guards? Who will be taken prisoner by our troops during the assault, Comrade Stalin?" Rokossowski: "You are not thinking clearly, Comrade Rokossowski. What prisoners?" This seemingly nonsensical exchange was, in fact, a perfectly clear order. Stalin's repeated feigned ignorance: what guards? Logically, what prisoners? Logically was a deliberate rhetorical device. He was explicitly rejecting the very premise of the question. By refusing to acknowledge the existence of the guards as legitimate prisoners of war, he was defining them as something else, vermin to be exterminated. He was instructing Rokossowski that there should be no captives. The message was unambiguous. No one was to be taken alive. The phrase, "what prisoners?" was not a question. It was a death sentence. The order was executed with ruthless efficiency. Upon liberating the camp, Soviet troops did not bother with the pretense of processing the SS guards and camp staff. They were not disarmed and placed in compounds. They were summarily executed on the spot. The method was likely swift and clinical, a bullet to the back of the head, the standard NKVD procedure. As the original transcript notes, after the liberation, none of the guards, warders, and other personnel survived. The Red Army, hardened by years of brutal warfare and infused with a deep personal hatred for the Nazis who had ravaged their homeland, required no further explanation. Stalin's will was law, and his vague questions were understood as a command for total annihilation. This approach differed significantly from the often chaotic and personal vengeance seen in camps liberated by the Western Allies. In the Soviet zone, retribution was centralized, ideological, and impersonal. It was an extension of state policy. The guards at Pilsen Stowe were not killed because individual soldiers were overcome with rage, though that sentiment certainly existed. They were killed because a directive from the highest authority had deemed them unworthy of life and outside the protections of any convention. Their deaths were a political act as much as an act of justice. Stalin's motivation was multifaceted. It served as brutal propaganda, demonstrating to the Soviet people that their leadership would show no mercy to those who had tormented them. It also ensured there would be no living witnesses to potentially testify about the camp's liberation, a process the Soviets preferred to control completely. Furthermore, it eliminated any need for complex legal proceedings against individuals who were, in the Soviet view, collectively guilty and undeserving of a trial. The event at Pilsen Stowe, whether entirely accurate in detail or amplified into parable, encapsulates the Eastern Front's endgame. It was a realm where the lines between military operation and political purge blurred completely. Justice was not delegated to judges or juries. It was dispensed by soldiers following implicit orders from a remote dictator. The conversation between Stalin and Rokossowski became a legendary example of how the Soviet system operated. Through illusion, where the unsaid was more important than the said, and where a seemingly confused query could condemn hundreds to death without a single written order. It was the ultimate, chillingly efficient form of liberation-era retribution. silent, systematic, and absolute. The liberation of the camps ended an empire of cruelty, but it also unleashed vengeance long suppressed. Were these executions justice or revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comment box below.